Hello, my name is Dave Dubin. I'm with the Center for Informatics Research in Science and Scholarship at the University of Illinois, and we're one of the partners on the Data Conservancy. I'm going to talk with you about two models for research data identity and provenance today. The plan for the presentation is to review some background of this work. We'll list some of the goals that we're trying to achieve with the work. I'll describe the two models and suggest some further reading. The Data Conservancy community is headquartered at Johns Hopkins University and includes a number of different partners that you can find out about on dataconservancy.org. The activities that we're involved with include investigation of research data practices, creation of infrastructure for data management tools and services, development of educational programs, and the definition of models for long-term data management and sustainability, and it's the last activity that I'll be talking about today. I'm going to go over two abstract models for data identity and provenance. BRM stands for the Basic Representation Model, and SAM stands for the Systematic Assertion Model. And these are directed toward the problems of establishing that two different digital resources encode the same data, interpreting the structure of digital data for integration and reuse, tracking the provenance of digital data for trust and verification, acknowledging and crediting the contributions to creating a data set, balancing local encoding control with standardization for reuse, and along the way, we hope to understand what data really is. So how are we going to do that? Well, not by giving you a particular technology that solves the problems for you, nor by proposing a particular metadata format or notation. Instead, we are proposing a logical framework that can serve as a basis for metadata languages so that descriptions conforming to the model contain information that software tools can use to solve problems. Along the way, we'd like the models to be instrumental in reinforcing good stewardship practices like documenting your data file format, keeping logs of data transformations, citing evidence that justifies your belief in the fidelity of your data, taking responsibility for your interpretation of evidence. And our models use those things in a theory of what it means to be data and how we understand different senses of the same data. Now, in some provenance models you may be familiar with, data artifacts undergo genuine change. Provenance is about their coming into existence and their participation in a life cycle that involves their change over time. But our models take a different approach. In order to have a clear basis for identity, data are understood to be immutable abstract particulars. Specifically, data content, which is distinct in our models from the data itself, is propositional. So propositions are the language-independent bearers of truth values and the objects of epistemic attitudes. That is to say, they're things that can be true or false. They're things that you can believe to be true, doubt are true, and so on. Propositions can stand in conjunctive relations with each other. So the content of a single spreadsheet cell is a proposition, and the content of an entire data set is also a giant conjunctive proposition. And these propositions are themselves independent of any particular linguistic or symbolic expression. And so the basic representational model defines an encoding stack that connects propositions to the physical matter and energy that carry them through an encoding stack of layers of symbol structure. As a simplification, the highest level of encoding is understood to be the primary expression. And so you're going to see that these are similar to, but not exactly like, the IFLA FRBR Group 1 entities. So we have at the top of the stack the propositional content, the abstract content of data. Then any number of layers of symbol structure connected by encoding relations. So this would be, for example, let's say a RDF description as the primary symbol structure, and then an XML info set as the next layer of encoding, and let's say a Unicode text file as the layer below that. Let's say you've got UTF-8 below that, and then bit sequence below that, and so on down to the particular arrangements of matter and or energy that ultimately carry the data. Now those relationships are context-free, and the systematic assertion model is going to bring in the decisions and the choices made by researchers. And in bringing the interpretations and the choices of the researchers and the research events that define the process of working with data, the systematic assertion model is influenced by the data theoretic work of Clyde Hamilton Coombs. So what we're talking about is how some symbol structures become data and how some propositions become data content. Remember that these abstract particulars are immutable, but they acquire contingent properties, like the property of being data or the property of being data content, in virtue of participating in provenance events in research. Two very broad superclasses for events in the conduct of science and scholarship are observation and computation. So here observation could be observation of anything, and computation in the broadest sense of Turing's execution of an effective procedure. And then our symbol structures and propositions are going to acquire the contingent properties of being data or being data content through linguistic acts which bring illocutionary force to propositions, like assertions, for example. And where the assertions appeal for justification to some observation or some computation, we understand those assertions to be systematic, and so data content are going to be the substance of systematic assertions, and data itself are the primary expressions for systematic assertions. So here's an example using a Dublin Core abstract model description, serialized here in trig format as a named graph, description 1, as the expression of a conjunctive proposition, which is to say the content of each of these statements concerning a Darwin Core occurrence, the classification of a specimen according to a species. And so we have the scientific name of the species, the depth at which the specimen was taken, the year in which this classification took place, and so on. Now, above description 1, EX record content, we understand as representing the language-independent propositional content of the data that is expressed below it. So if we had a different metadata language or some different way of expressing the same content, then both expressions would share the same propositional content. The other relationship that you see above, SAM substance of, is going to connect that propositional content to a particular assertion event by data stewards who are receiving and curating that data. And on this slide, we see the assertion event. We know that the agent here of this event is the KU Biodiversity Institute. It'd be nice to have information about when this took place, but since this represents the ingestion of the data into a repository, that implies that the curating agents are going to assert that they believe the data to be accurate. And so this assertion, justified by the earlier observation event that took place in 1965, qualifies as a systematic assertion. The KU Biodiversity Institute staff were not present in 1965 when the specimen was examined, but they still justify their belief in the data with an appeal to the earlier observation by Martin Wiley. So a couple of clarifications here. Remember that the RDF vocabulary used is just an example. What's important is the information that's captured and how one understands it. What we don't see is some other work we've done with our models clarifying our notion of interpretive conventions that govern the encoding relationships in BRM. That is to say, the relationship between bit sequences and ASCII characters, or ASCII characters and XML documents. These are contingent relationships, and we understand those mappings as being something that also has to be tracked, and we call those interpretive frames. Now, different senses of scientific equivalence amount to strict identity at different levels of the model that I've just described. So you could have two different data sets that have exactly the same content but different serialization, or they could have the same serialization but a different lower level encoding. Or in the case of a challenge or reinterpretation, you could have the same evidence, the same justification, but different content, and so on. Now, in the examples on the previous slide, each of the levels of the model, the proposition and the symbol structure, were represented as resources with their own identity. But there's no reason why you couldn't, with a different RDF vocabulary or some other metadata standard, simply define a relationship like same content or same symbol structure or same justification and so on. So like I say, we're not pushing a particular metadata language, but rather suggesting particular relationships and how you might understand them. The model itself is expressed using description logic axioms. These are the 9 most important out of about 40, defining, for example, that a systematic assertion is an assertion that is warranted by observation or computation, that data content is either substance of a systematic assertion or conjunct of other data content. So once the trig graph in the earlier slide is understood to be expressing data content, then the content of each of the individual statements in that Darwin core occurrence record is also data content. And data itself is the primary expression for a systematic assertion. If you'd like more information about these models, including more details of the examples that I had on the slides, we presented a paper at the 2012 ASYST meeting, and the DOI is listed here. We've done a number of papers about SAM and BRM, including a poster at the second RDA plenary on how these could serve as complementary account of provenance, complementary to other approaches to provenance like the World Wide Web Consortium's PROV model. But this ASYST paper has the most complete description of the entities and the relationships in SAM and BRM and how they relate to each other. So I recommend this one as the place to start. Thank you very much.